And John, I'll watch the waiting room and let people
Okay.
leave.
Hey, everyone, we're going to give it maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 more minutes to let some of the folks level out with getting in on the call so we don't get started too soon. So yeah, give us a couple more minutes and we'll be ready to go. In the meantime, feel free to pop your name and where you're from and what you do in the chat. That'd be great for the folks that we don't know and our presenters today. All right, I'm going to give it 1 more minute. Go ahead and, if you would, please put your name and where you're from, what you do in the chat, just so we get to know everybody. This is great. We got folks from across the country here, so thanks for joining. All right, we appeared to have leveled off. We have a nice group today. I'm going to give a quick intro, then I'm going to hand it off to our presenters. So I'm really excited for the session today. It's titled An Introduction to the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute and Connections to the Southern Region. Extremely thankful for the great cadre from the Institute that joined us today. Jason Taylor, Teresa Hollingsworth, Chris Armitage, and Kathy Zeller. I'll let them do a little more detailed intros once they get started up here, but really thanks to them for joining and giving us this presentation. Thanks to all of you for joining as well. We planned this summer series of webinars as a complement to the National Wilderness Skills Institute that occurred back in May. That was a virtual offering for the whole country. And we wanted to stay connected with some of our Southern region partners and beyond. So we're excited to keep this going. We're hoping, once again, we keep saying this, to be back in person in 2022 and hope to see you all there. Just keep that in the back of your mind. And we're going to be working on that over the winter time to hopefully meet back up at the Cradle near Brevard on the Pisgah National Forest. I wanted to thank our WSI planning team that helped put some of this together. Eric Giebelstein, he's the acting executive director for SAWS. Eric's on the call. Stephen Aaron with ATC. Stephen, I apologize. I don't know your title off the tip of my tongue. I apologize for that. Kate DeVerona with SAWS. She's a program manager. Matt Drury with ATC as well. And then Natalie Lester, who's our general point of contact on the Pisgah Ranger District. So they're the ones that help pull this off. And just a reminder, we're recording and we'll be monitoring the chat box. You can put questions in there. If they pause or ask you guys to come off mute, or I don't think everyone's muted, so stay muted while they're presenting. And then if you have a question, throw it in the chat and we can open it up anytime. With this size of group, I think we can be fairly informal. And we really encourage questions and you have an interaction with folks from the Research Institute. So unless there are any questions, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to hand it over to Jason Taylor.
All right, thanks, John. Let me see if I can get the screen shared properly. Let's see, share, and then start.
I can see your PowerPoint there.
All right, that feels successful. It's a good way to start. All right, so thanks, John. So hello, everyone, and just want to offer greetings from Missoula, Montana. I'm Jason Taylor, the director of the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, and today I'm fortunate to be leading off the presentations, and to do so, I'll have a bit of framing. I talk a little bit about governance, and I'll end with a few examples of current work, kind of broad, high-level interagency efforts that are going on at the Institute. But before I do all of that, I want to just do a quick introduction to me so you can get to know me a little more. I grew up in Michigan. I was there 35 years of my life, a product of the University of Michigan. Have a wife and two little ones, 5.5-year-old twins at home who started their life up in Alaska and have been out in wilderness. Not yet all across the country, but in some pretty fantastic places. So we hope to keep up that trend. By training, I'm a landscape ecologist, land use, land cover change, birds, bioacoustics, land use policy, those kind of issues. And I've been super fortunate to work for the National Park Service and the BLM before coming to the Forest Service, and spent my time in Colorado out on Cape Cod, and then the last 5 years up in Alaska. And I've also been very fortunate to work on some international issues related to biodiversity conservation, excuse me, in the Arctic. I don't know about where you are, but my allergies are killing me right now. So I apologize for that. So since our time together today is about wilderness research, I wanted to start off with an icebreaker of sorts. So John had mentioned that we're trying to have a bit of a dialogue with the audience today. And so just wanted to ask this question: why do we conduct research in or for wilderness? And I'm curious what your thoughts are. So if you wouldn't mind, jump into the chat and share a few thoughts. Why do we conduct research in or for wilderness? What are your thoughts? And I'm just realizing right now, John, that I can't see the chat. So maybe as those ideas are coming in, you could share them, just kind of read them out loud.
A sec. I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, first, it's a great baseline to preserve wilderness character. No other place to do it. Let's see. To benefit wilderness, understand the natural state of the ecosystem. Most undisturbed landscapes. Because you got NFF funding.
That's interesting.
Because of the Wilderness Act, and to learn from preserving wild places. And then we got an LOL, I think, about the NFF funding. We need to know if wilderness as the most protective land of the country is being managed well towards wilderness values.
All right, so maybe I'll carry on, and if anything else jumps in, you can share it with us. Sorry, I can't see that. I was going to interact with kind of the chat a little bit more there.
Sometimes I can make it work, but you got to be running two screens, and sometimes it'll pop up somewhere else. I thought, but yeah, we could have checked on that. Sorry about that.
It's all good. We'll make do. Thanks for reading those out loud. And I'll just say thanks to everybody. And let me go back one. Thanks to everybody for sharing those responses. And they're all great responses, right? I'm going to take a little more pragmatic approach to this. And there are absolutely, like the responses we got in the chat box, there are absolutely many possible ways to answer this question of why we conduct research in wilderness. For me, the most pragmatic answer, or the most fundamental answer, is because law and policy state it will be so. And so what I have here are a few examples of either policy statements or law statements or excerpts from law that will drive home this point of why we conduct research in wilderness. And you'll see several of the responses that people provided in the comments there are captured in these snippets here. So first, I want to mention, it's not on the screen, but I want to recognize someone mentioned the Wilderness Act, right? So to start with, absolutely, the Wilderness Act specifies that wilderness areas shall be devoted to public purposes, right? And one of those public purposes is scientific use. But if we just take a deep dive into, or a slightly deeper dive into the policy statements or the snippets from law, there's direction that's been given to managers that manage the NWPS in relation to not only conducting science and using science. And for me, this is where our charge primarily comes from. So I have an example from each of the 4 bureaus. So from our friends at the Fish and Wildlife Service, the policy recognizes that scientific and scholarly activities are important because it's critical. This information is critical for making public policies. This doesn't speak specifically to wilderness, but more generally about science to support policy making. We look to our friends at the Park Service. It says that it's stated in law that management will be enhanced by the availability and utilization of a broad program of highest quality science and information, and that management in wilderness will include and be guided by a coordinated program of scientific inventory, monitoring, and research. And so we're starting to see that it's mandated, right? That research will happen and that managers will use research to conduct their stewardship activities. So looking at the BLM, policy states that we'll use science, local knowledge, partnerships, and volunteers to effectively manage the NLCS units. It's old language. It's National Landscape Conservation System. They're now called the National Conservation Lands. And NLCS, or National Conservation Lands, is the program within which wilderness sits in the BLM. So let's see. So, and additionally here we have, and if you look in BLM manual 6340, it says wilderness offers important and unique opportunities for research in areas relatively unmodified by modern people. That language, relatively unmodified by modern people, is critically important. I think something that we need to spend more attention or pay more attention to those words, modern people, in consideration of wilderness activities. And then last but certainly not least, we look to Forest Service management policies, and I know 2300 is being updated, but we have this language here now that will gather information and carry out research in a manner compatible with preserving wilderness to understand wilderness ecology, uses, opportunities, and visitor behavior. So we're directed to conduct research in and for wilderness, but our research must be done in a manner that preserves wilderness character, right? That wilderness character piece persists even for research in support of wilderness specifically. So to loop back to that opening point, why do we conduct research in wilderness? Again, there are many answers to this question, but from a very foundational basis, it's because law and policy state this will be so. We will conduct the research and we will use it. Okay, so one more just bit of context here. I want to introduce Aldo Leopold. Of course, many of you or all of you will know that he's considered the father of modern conservation, especially wildlife conservation in the United States. What you may not know is that Aldo was a Forest Service employee in the early 1920s, And it's really because of Aldo, or his persistence, I guess you might say, that that we have the first wilderness area in the United States. Of course, it was designated administratively by the Forest Service in 1924, the Gila Wilderness, but it's what started the wilderness movement, so to speak, in our country. And of course, Aldo Leopold, his work and the man himself contributed to the work that led up to the eventual passing of the Wilderness Act. So it's for these reasons that our institute bears his name, the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. Okay, so about that institute, we're a national interagency federal research facility located on campus at the University of Montana. And that, heavy on that interagency piece, I'll come back to that. We are a Forest Service shop, but that's where the story starts. We're equally a BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service shop, and we serve all the bureaus equally. Now, hopefully I'll make that point a couple times along the way here. And it's certainly true that many people within the Forest Service and elsewhere conduct wilderness relevant science. It just happens to be that we're the only federal research group in the United States that's wholly dedicated to science to support the stewardship, in particular, of the National Wilderness Preservation System. So the mission of the Institute is advancing wilderness stewardship through transformational science. And back to that point about the interagency piece. So the Leopold Institute was established in 1993, but it was preceded by a wilderness management unit, a Forest Service Research and Development Wilderness Management Unit. But in 1993, that year is important not only because the Leopold Institute was formally charged, but that's also the year that the Institute became an interagency outfit focused on serving the needs of the entire National Wilderness Preservation System versus only being focused on Forest Service needs. So in thinking about governance here, we are administered by the Rocky Mountain Research Station, which is part of the Forest Service Research and Development Deputy Area. But again, we're an interagency organization, and we're guided by and responsive to the 4 National Wilderness Preservation System Management Bureaus, again, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and National Park Service. USGS is part of this conversation too. And our charge is, again, to serve each of those bureaus equally. And so to meet those needs, to meet that interagency need, we receive guidance, we'll say, from the Interagency Wilderness Policy Council, which consists of Washington level executives from each of those bureaus. And we participate as a member of the Interagency Wilderness Steering Committee, which is a body that's designed to facilitate collaborative management or co-management of the NWPS across the various bureaus. And so we have bureau reps that serve on the steering committee, but also the Leopold Institute and the Carhart Training Center, the directors of those 2 institutions serve as members of the Interagency Wilderness Steering Committee. So I just want to be clear when I say Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, in this case, wilderness means units of the National Wilderness Preservation System, right? So federally designated wilderness areas. We do work also in wilderness study areas and other areas that could potentially be wilderness or have wilderness character, but our primary charge, when I say wilderness, I mean units of the National Wilderness Preservation System. That's our bread and butter, so to speak, and where most of our work needs to happen. And that is all 111 million acres, all 800 plus units. You know, I haven't counted yet, but someday I'll count how many managers, 300, 400, 500 managers, which manage those 800 units. And then, and then we have support staff. So maybe it's many thousands of people that are engaged here, and really all other stewards of wilderness. But 800, I think about this sometimes, like trying to meet the research needs of 111 million acres and 800 units. It's maybe not achievable with a team of 6 or 8 people, but we do our level best to try to meet the highest priority needs as often as we can. We'll come back to that idea. So then if we're talking about all 111 million acres and all 800 units, our work geographically speaking, is from the far southeast in Everglades, which we'll talk about a little more later, to the far northwest and the largest and most intact wilderness areas that we have in the United States. And we have a relatively small team, relatively small, but I would say extremely talented and extremely effective team of social scientists, biologists, ecologists, and so on. And you'll meet a few of our scientists later today. And it's also important to mention or to share, like the Institute's at a time of transition. So over the last 3 years, we've had 60 plus years worth of experience retire. And the giants of wilderness research, Peter Landers and David Cole and Alan Watson, and most recently Kara Miller have all retired. And so we're at a time of transition, and in the last year or so, we hired 2 new scientists, Chris and Kathy, who you'll hear from today, and we are just finishing the process right now to hire a new research ecologist. And just yesterday, an announcement opened for a new scientist focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. And I'll come back to that point a little later. So we are a small team and we are evolving, but it's a fantastic team too. And I hope you all get an opportunity to work with our team. And I'm just thinking they're fantastic human beings and fantastic scientists equally. So great people to work with. One other thing I wanted to mention about the team is that most of the staff at certainly all the scientists, or most of the scientists, are research grade scientists. And so practically speaking, what that means is that the work that they do is kind of the evaluation and reward structure, if you will, is guided by the federal RGEG, so the Research Grade Evaluation Guide. So really what this means on the ground is that as we're thinking about the work that we do, we're always trying to strike a balance between scientific exploration, scientific independence by those individual scientists, and trying to align that with management needs of our Bureau partners. And it's not always an easy place to find, but it's boy, if we can do things that are kind of academically or scientifically intriguing and valuable, and at the same time meet management needs, like that's the sweet spot, and where we try to keep most of our work most of the time. And then one more thing I want to mention here about staff or about the team is that we commonly host postdocs and students and visiting scholars, and we have 3 new postdocs starting this fall. One focused on climate change, one focused on kind of connectivity work, or actually 2 focused on connectivity work in different parts of the country. And if you're interested in spending some time out in Missoula with us, please reach out. We have space in the building, and we're always happy to make new friends and bring people in the building to work with us for a short or extended period of time. All right, and then speaking of visiting scholars, it's also worth mentioning that we have a rich history of international collaboration and hosting international scholars and fellows. And so if you have partners around the globe doing good work with wilderness and can use our help, or you think might be there's value in developing partnerships, we're always open to making new friends and developing new collaborations. Okay, let's talk a little bit about our work here. Excuse me. So broadly speaking, our work falls out into one of 3 bins. And so science for wilderness, wilderness for science, and wilderness for landscape sustainability. So that first box, science for wilderness, is science and tools. It's like generating the information and the tools to help managers and stewards actually effectively manage and steward the resources on the ground, right? So this is where historically we've spent most of our time doing science to support stewardship of wilderness, and this is where we'll spend most of our time going forward as well. But as mentioned in the comments early on, wilderness, this notion of wilderness for science, using wilderness areas as scientific laboratories is a fantastic idea, not the least of which because wilderness areas are relatively free from the impacts of modern humans, right? Back to that modern humans idea. So there's a unique opportunity to think about not only just to understand ecological systems, kind of free of modern impacts, relatively free of modern impacts, but also to use what we learn in those areas to understand the changes that we're seeing in more managed landscapes. And then that final container, wilderness for landscape sustainability, is now thinking about the value of wilderness, excuse me, to broader social ecological systems. And so how does wilderness impact ecological, economic, and social systems in broader landscapes nearby wilderness, but also much farther afield than the wilderness unit itself. And here's that map that I mentioned, or I guess the point I mentioned earlier about our work being kind of sparse in the east. So what I did here with this map is just kind of a crude representation of where our work's happening around the country. And each star represents a different project that has been identified in our FY fiscal year 2021 work plan. So this is not all the work we're doing, nor is it all the work we're going to do. But what it does kind of highlight here is that we have, what you can't see is the thematic distribution, but it gives us an idea of the geographic distribution of our work. So it does not include work that's international and or work that is intends to serve the entire national wilderness preservation system. These are projects that have a specific geography tied to that work. And so the point I really want to make with this particular slide is that it will be obvious that we don't have a lot of work in the East. And in part, what we hope to do today with this conversation is to inspire future collaborations and add a few more stars on the right-hand side of that map for work that we could do in FY22 and beyond. Okay, in the next few slides here, I've got 3 projects that I want to talk about, and they are examples of the kind of work that we do or facilitate. And all 3 of these are interagency in scope and focused on priority stewardship needs. So the first is forthcoming general technical report. Sorry about that. General technical report. And it was, this work was started in 2014 when the Wilderness Act turned 50. And it's important to also note that this work was funded by all 4 NWPS bureaus. This work, this general technical report, is very near completion. I've been saying that for the last few months, and it's worth noting that because of the potential widespread relevance and use of the report, it's led to additional reviews. And the report is currently with the Forest Service, the Research and Development Washington office, and being reviewed by the Office of Tribal Relations. And so as soon as this report is available, we'll share it broadly. Certainly John and Eric and others can make sure that all the partners get a hold of that as we go forward. And just a quick look inside the front cover, just so you can kind of see what kind of information here is in the report. The report's 10 chapters long and nearly 200 pages, or just over 200 pages really. And it covers topics from social relevance of wilderness to economic impacts, to use trends, tribal values, and so on. And it's definitely not, I wouldn't label it as a comprehensive treatise on wilderness in America. But we certainly believe that it's an important contribution in thinking about conversations we're having today around the benefits of wilderness in contemporary society.
Hey,
Okay.
Jason, why there's a break right there. And I had 2 questions pop up in the chat that I just wanted to ask, or you could defer them if one of the other presenters is going to address it. But the first one was, what are the 2 eastern stars on your map? And then, where'd my chat go? Then the second question was, what are the parameters for studying landscapes outside of the National Wilderness Preservation System around the globe? Those were the 2 questions I think that are, there might be one more coming in here, but I'll stop with those 2 if you don't mind, or you can defer these till later on.
No, so the 2 stars in the far southeast is Everglades National Park, and Chris is going to talk about that work later in the presentation. And then in Missouri, is the 11, I think it's the 11 points Wild Scenic River. Alan Watson had done some work, and Chris had carried that on after Alan's departure. So he can talk more about that work when he comes on also, if there's an opportunity to do so. But those are the two stars that you see there. And Chris will fill in with a whole bunch more examples of historical wilderness relevant work to the Southeast region when he comes on a little bit later.
Okay.
And then the second question about what are the parameters? To be honest, there aren't specific parameters. To me, there are two things that come to mind most immediately. One is advancing wilderness stewardship, right? And so it's this notion that we have a national wilderness preservation system. There are other countries around the globe that have, or at least trying to have, similar systems or slightly different systems, or they're managing wilderness without a system and trying to find a path forward. And so if we can contribute to more broadly to the kind of broader kind of conservation of wilderness globally, we want to help there. But also if there are opportunities for us to engage in international work that allows us to learn something and bring that back to help with stewardship with wilderness in the United States, we want to do that, right? And so there's kind of an altruistic component to that kind of international service, but there's also a value-added benefit when we can take what we've learned abroad and bring that back and help us steward lands here at home a little bit better. So that would be a knee-jerk response, and I could chew on that some more if there's time, John, a little bit later.
No, you got a thanks from that commenter. And then I had one more pop up while you were talking, if you don't mind. It says,
no, please.
Historically, why has more research occurred in the West? And, you know, these are the big areas that get attention, or is it that they're better staffed, or is it some other reason, or they can support wilderness research better?
So the honest truth is I don't know, but I have I have speculation to offer. And the way I normally respond to this is proximity is one. Our facility is in Missoula, so it's in the West. It's generally easier to get out and do field work when there's reasonable proximity. And you see there's probably more stars in the Northwest than anywhere. The other is most of the wilderness area in the United States is in the West. And so naturally there's going to be more stars in the West. That doesn't necessarily excuse that there aren't more stars in the East. But I just think it may be an artifact of kind of where the acreage resides. In any case, we're aware of the geographic disparity, and we're being very deliberate about trying to march east and make sure that we're meeting the wilderness stewardship kind of research needs of the entire system. At least, like, we can't meet the needs of all 800 units, but we need to have representative support around the country in any given year or every 3 years or something like that. So I'm not entirely sure how we got here, but I know we're going to work to add more stars on the right side of the map as we go forward. Hope that helps.
No, that's great. And like we discussed, this might be a very informal or, you know, not a huge step towards beginning some of those conversations. So as the folks on this call are thinking about that, we're looking for those connections, and, you know, we're always open to hear about them. So keep thinking about that stuff.
Thank you.
Back to you, Jason. That's all the questions we have for the moment.
Okay, just got 2 more projects here that I want to tell you about, and then I'll have a transition slide to Teresa. So the second project here is related to climate change, and you know, this really started with the team, kind of internal team conversation, and the question was, what the heck are we going to do about climate change and wilderness? And as those conversations evolved, we started working with some folks in the National Park Service and their climate change response team, and with the Interagency Wilderness Steering Committee. And just through conversations, we almost happened upon this work that's being done by this RAD team. There's an interagency team called FedNet that stood up to brainstorm, to flesh out, to evaluate this decision-making framework called RAD, which is resist, accept, direct. So when you think about the potential effects of climate change, are you going to resist those? Are you going to accept those? Or are you going to direct those? So that work's been going on for the last couple of years. There are a fair number of publications that are coming out right now in relation to that work. For public lands writ large. But what's been missing in that conversation all along the way is, what are you going to do about wilderness? And so I've heard from the RAD team that question comes up somewhat regularly. And so we hope to fill the hole. Like, what are we going to do about climate change and wilderness? And certainly we're not going to have all the answers. And when you think about, think about addressing this climate change conundrum on public lands, that's hard enough. But when you overlay wilderness laws and regulations, policies, and ethos and ethics and public opinion, thinking about addressing climate change in wilderness becomes like maybe impossible, right? It's certainly incredibly challenging. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to fill that wilderness gap, and the Institute will lead a multi-bureau team of scientists and managers to conduct an assessment of using RAD in wilderness. And the idea is that we will identify at least one, probably one, at most two study area in each of the bureaus. So Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Parks will pick a unit in each of those where there's a sticky wilderness problem that's going on that needs some brainstorming behind it, right? And so the idea is we'll take a scenarios-based approach, if you will, to try to evaluate if you do nothing and accept change, something's going to happen. If you resist change, try to stop it, something's going to happen. Or if you try to direct change, something else is going to happen. So can we evaluate what those downstream outcomes might be to help managers make better decisions today about the challenges they have in front of them? So we're in the process right now of hiring a 3-year postdoc, which coincidentally is co-funded by Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Parks to lead the work. And then that postdoc will be a convener of national conversations, and all of the scientists on the team at the Institute will contribute to this work and just try to get us to a place a couple of years down the road where we can have managers have a process to build decisions upon, as difficult as it might be. And so I'll leave that there and go to the last project. Not really a project, it's more like a line of work now. So I mentioned that we just advertised, it opened yesterday for a research scientist. It could be a social scientist or a natural resource manager, but a person focused on relevancy, diversity, and inclusion. And I can't tell you how excited we are about this. And it's also worth mentioning, in the last year, I sit in on the equivalent of Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers regional program manager calls. Forest Service has that, but Park Service, BLM, and Fish and Wildlife Service have similar calls. And the two most common themes that I've heard, challenges, management challenges, or things that are these wicked problems, if you will, and we don't know, like we want to respond better, we want to do better, we want to do something meaningful, but we don't know what to do. Those two are climate change and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Incredibly important topics. And so because of that, because of hearing that, we take on a climate change project because maybe we can help. The other thing is, how do we engage a more diverse audience? How can we be more inclusive? What does that even mean? Right? How can we advance equity in wilderness? Well, the answer is I don't know. But what we do know is that we can hire a scientist to focus on these issues as a core part of their job to help answer some of these questions and provide awareness, understanding, tools, partnerships, what have you, to managers to be able to make better decisions in this regard. And so this is what we're going to do. So our hope for this work is to understand recreational experiences, preferences, barriers, and incentives to under-resourced, underserved, underrepresented communities. Try to understand what relevancy actually means. So what does relevancy mean to different cultures and different kind of subpopulations within those cultures? And once we start to understand that, can we then hand that knowledge to managers so you can make better decisions on the ground about ensuring wilderness areas are more relevant? And to understand value and use by different user groups. And while it could lead us into uncomfortable places, we want to start asking questions about existing laws and policies to ask if they're, to evaluate if they advance equity and inclusion. Most importantly, with all of this work, we want to be able to improve access to families from all backgrounds to wilderness. If they want to engage wilderness, there should be an opportunity to do so. And so hopefully the work that we're going to lead on DEI will help managers advance opportunity for everyone. All right, then my very last slide. I realize I'm running on long. This is what happens when we realize we have lots of time and we don't have to do it in 15 minutes. Hopefully it's been valuable. So the last slide here is just to introduce this idea of a science charter. So Forest Service, our research and development units operate on are guided by documents called science charters, right? And so science charters dictate or stipulate broad research themes or problem areas that are the sideboards. They basically dictate or guide the work that the institutes or the labs will do over the next 10 years. And so we have a fairly significant effort underway right now to develop our next strategic plan. Our current charter expires in September of 2022. And our first one was in 1993 when the Institute was founded. And so through this rechartering process, we've tried to be fairly deliberate in engaging partners as much as possible. So it's fantastic if we do work that's intellectually stimulating, but again, if we can find that sweet spot between things that are intellectually stimulating and are needed on the ground, that's our target. And so we've been reaching out to partners across the country and really across the globe to understand what kind of research questions do you need answered, and then as we think about aggregating those questions, what kind of research topics, what are your priority research topics? And the idea is that we integrate all of that into our path forward. And so Teresa Hollingsworth, who's our next speaker, will provide more details on the process and a link, try to inspire you to go and insert your research priorities along the way. And so that's where I end. And I'll just say the speakers coming up here are Teresa, Deputy Director, Kathy Zeller, research biologist, Chris Armitage, who's a research social scientist. And I should say in each case, it's Dr. Teresa, Dr. Kathy, and Dr. Chris. So Teresa, I'll stop sharing my screen. And I guess maybe John, as we're transitioning, ask if there are any other questions that I can help answer.
There was one in the chat. I don't know if if you addressed it directly in your talk. What is the estimate for timeline for hiring the postdoc to lead the RAD team or the RAD research?
I mean, I think the answer is now. Like we're doing interviews over the next 3 weeks, say, and so hopefully we'll have someone on board in, definitely by September. Hopefully we have actually somebody in the building, assuming we can be in the building, but somebody on the team by then to fire up the work.
Great, thanks. Not seeing any more questions unless someone wants to come off mute for Jason or pop it in the chat. Otherwise, Teresa, I think we're ready for you to share your screen.
Okay, I do see one more question.
Yeah, I saw that one too. The nonprofits?
Yeah, that maybe you want to answer, Jason, before we.
So in part, I don't know the answer to that question. I can tell you that in the last year, there's been relatively little engagement with nonprofits in the sense like coming to the Institute and working with us on specific projects. We have any number of partnerships. So just to highlight the Bob Marshall Wilderness Area again, because they're close and it's easy to sit down at the park and have a chat. And we just talked recently about the possibility for citizen science engagement, right? And so I think we have, and others can jump in along the way, but there are examples all around the country of nonprofits where we've engaged from a scientific avenue. So I'm thinking about like the work with the Wilderness Society is a good example. And so there's always opportunity to engage nonprofits on a scientific level. This conversation we just had with Bob Marshall about about engaging citizen science and scientists in work. I don't know where that goes yet, but that's another kind of example. Teresa and the team just this morning were having conversations about potentially engaging teachers and development of wilderness curriculum. And so maybe there's opportunity to work with nonprofits there. And so I would say there's not a defined set of ways that we can work together. If you have an interest in wilderness stewardship and there's a science nexus, let's talk. I think there are all kinds of ways we could work together. That doesn't exactly answer the question, but hopefully it opens the door to further conversation.
Okay, I will go ahead and hopefully share my screen. All right, can everybody see that? And I can't see the chat now either, so someone's gonna have to tell me.
I can't see your screen yet, Teresa.
Okay. Huh. I'm pretty sure I mean, I clicked share.
Sometimes if you have multiple screens, oh, here it comes.
Okay, maybe it was
Might have
just
been-
taking a while.
Maybe a delay, yeah.
All
We
right.
can see you in the raft.
Okay, well, hopefully each slide advance won't delay. I'd like to blame the fact that I'm in the far wilds of Alaska and our internet is horrible up here sometimes. So my name is Teresa Hollingsworth, and I'm the acting deputy director at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. And when I am not doing this job, my permanent job is a research ecologist with the PNW Research Station. I'm the boreal ecology team leader, where I study the structure and function of boreal and Arctic ecosystems in the face of climate change. And in particular, thinking about post-disturbance successional trajectories. And I'm also very interested and have a strong emphasis on partnerships with Indigenous people and tribes in my work. So as I mentioned, I'm based out of Fairbanks, Alaska, where I'm actually the farthest North Forest Service employee. And I'd say living and working and playing in Alaska has really shaped my passion for wild areas. I was primarily hired at the Institute to lead the development and writing of the ALRI Science Charter, which will guide the Institute's research emphases over the next 10 years, as well as outline our mission statement, our goals, and our future. And so today I'm going to focus a fair bit of my talk on that. And then I'm also going to give an overview of a few ALRI projects, one from a couple of other scientists who couldn't be here today, and then one that's starting up that I'm involved in, which is really cool because I didn't know that I'd be able to do some science when I took this position. And so it makes me very excited. So it is not, okay, there we go, sorry. All right, so when we're thinking about the ALRI Science Charter, as Jason mentioned, our working mission is advancing wilderness stewardship through transformational science. And the Science Charter is a collaborative effort with all the employees at ALRI. And as you can see, as you will see, it's been and will continue to be shaped by partner inputs and needs. We are guided by 8 principles to maintain high professional standards and credibility for the research that we conduct and facilitate, to be responsive to the spirit and letter of laws and policies governing wilderness management, and sensitive to the impacts and relevance of these laws and policies on different nations and demographic groups, to provide regional, national, and international leadership for wilderness research, to conduct science for wilderness, leverage wilderness for science, and study wilderness in the context of broader landscapes, emphasizing research with broad applicability, to strive to meet the evolving needs of wilderness managers, scientists, and interested publics by obtaining their views on high priority issues, to co-produce, communicate, and disseminate research, knowledge, and tools meaningful for wilderness and broader resource stewardship and education, to enhance research productivity and relevance by using diverse, creative, and collaborative approaches, and finally, to contribute to a creative, supportive, and generous work environment where dignity, respect, trust, diversity, and fairness encourage a team approach. Those are all pretty lofty. So developing a science charter for the OLRI is definitely a complex task because the science needs to be relevant to effective stewardship of the National Wilderness Preservation System and related wildlands, and we know that wildlands are diverse and expansive. Secondly, the capacity to pursue such needs are obviously infinite and are going to be significantly influenced by the current and future, the expertise of the current and future staff at the Institute. So addressing these fundamental program charter needs is a task that requires consideration of wilderness relevant legal and administrative policy, and then also thinking, as Jason mentioned, the guiding policy specifically for Forest Service research scientists, and then also to bring in the knowledge and opinions of a diverse range of wilderness stewards and interested parties. So to take advantage, to address this complexity, we took advantage of the fact that we have a social scientist at the Institute with knowledge and expertise in how to incorporate multiple partner input. And you'll hear a bit more from Chris today about some of his other projects. But in this project, one of the things that Chris proposed was bringing Q methodology to think about how we might prioritize a frame of work. Q methodology is a systematic study of participant viewpoints by asking participants to rank and sort statements. And so it's really an appropriate method for exploring different perspectives related to wilderness research because it requires participants to make trade-offs. And as I mentioned before, the Institute has finite resources, which means we're going to have to make trade-offs. So to start this process, we created what we labeled a universe of potential research topics and questions. And we had 100, we brainstormed and we looked through old charters and we looked through papers about wilderness research, and we came up with 178 research questions within 43 research topics. And then we asked for input and feedback from partners to see if we missed anything, or if they wanted to emphasize certain topics and questions. This was an online survey that we sent out, and we sent that link to many partners, federal, state, NGO, interest groups, as many as we possibly could think of. And we wanted to make sure we had as diverse of views as possible. I'm sorry, it keeps on advancing more quickly than I want. So the preliminary results and descriptives from that particular engagement, we had 232 unique visits to the site, 117 total comments, and 31 states and Washington, D.C. was represented. We did not receive visits from Alabama, Arkansas, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Iowa, Kansas. Actually, I'm not going to go through them all, but what I will say is that almost all of the states that we did not receive comments from have less than 2 wilderness areas in their state. So that was encouraging, although it also made me think that, you know, people outside of states where there's wilderness, you know, wilderness is still theirs to enjoy. And so thinking about how we can engage partners from those states, I think becomes really important. We also had 24 international visitors, and 8 of those commented, which was pretty neat. So before I go on to the next part of my talk, I have a question so we can engage the audience. what pressing wilderness related research topics do you have or do you think are important? And maybe again, somebody can just read them off to me.
Nothing is coming on yet, Teresa.
Oh, we're not going to move on until at least there's one research topic that people are interested in, because it plays right into the next part of the talk. So come on. I know
got
people
one.
are interested.
Need to reinstate the NSRE, National Survey on Recreation and the Environment, on public wilderness values.
Okay, so public wilderness values.
I'm just going to throw out there. Thanks for that, Pete.
How have opinions of wilderness changed over time since 1964?
Mhm. Can we get
throw one
one
out.
more?
It's very specific. Or let's see, are opportunities for isolation valued in the same way?
Okay.
And then recreation impacts, rec sites, campsites, rock climbing, user trails.
Okay, perfect. So we have 4 here. And the reason why I wanted people to throw out some topics, and they could be as specific as possible, it was a little altruistic, because I'm going to actually now give you a little tour of our Q methodology and the website that we have created for people to go and rank topics. And it's nice to, we're going to see if we can fit these research questions into research topics that we already have, and let's hope we can. That was my hope, because that means that we did a good job of creating those research topics. So here is the website, and anybody can go and enter their own rankings. And I'm going to try here to now share a different part of my screen, which I don't know, may or may not work well. Maybe I need to stop share and then share again. I think that's what I have to do. So hold on 1 second, sorry. It'll be so worth it. Maybe, okay. All right, so back here, share my screen again, and we're gonna go there. Can everybody see the screen?
It's just about to come up, I think. There it is. Yes, we can see it.
All right. So this is what this website looks like when you enter it, and you can see we give a little introduction and talk about what we are asking for and what we would like to see, and then you can click provide input, and we have a nice screen that talks about gives you some instructions. But because I'm going to walk through instructions, we don't need to read those. But what you can see here is we have lowest priority on the left and highest priority on the right. And we have a set of general research topics that people can rank. And so thinking about the four research questions we got, I think that they can all fall pretty nicely into some of the research topics we have. So let's see, we could go here and talk the wilderness experience. So that's thinking a little bit about that opportunity for solitude and how that might have changed. We also have, let's see, I know we have a rec one in here. There, impacts of wilderness on ecological resources is in there. We have supporting inventory monitoring. thinking about refining indicators of wilderness character, which I think gets a little bit at that public wilderness values. So essentially what you can do is you can stick in your own preferences of which of these are the most important to you. And then from there, you can, once you feel that you have done this to the best of your ability, you can move on. And we ask for a bit of demographic information to help us sort and think about the priorities and where they might be coming from. We also have, if you feel we missed a high priority integrated research topic, to please add it in so that we have that in our knowledge as we are writing our charter. And finally, we are setting up a set of virtual workshops to think a little bit more nuanced about what these responses meant to individual partners. And so we encourage anyone who wants to be a part of those workshops to select times that are good for them. And I am actually going to just put something in here that says this is a test so that we know that before I close it down. So I think I want to pause there just a little bit before I talk about some of the research projects, just to see if people have questions or about how to use this or about the process in general. No one has any questions? Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure we had a pause there in case people did feel like they wanted to ask a question.
Sorry, I couldn't get off mute quick enough. Wasn't particular with the website you were just talking about, but this says the challenge I hear throughout the southern region and experience myself is what does effective management look like, staffing levels, etc., not necessarily wilderness research, but would help the agency and specific units better manage their unique wildernesses. This might be a research topic you would want to get involved in and maybe not even get close to, but something that would benefit wilderness. If we don't know the answer, which we don't, it makes it hard to manage. So just maybe a comment, but a little bit of a question in there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, it's a solid point. I'm not really sure if I necessarily have a great response to that. I don't know if Jason or Chris or Kathy want to respond. I think, from my perspective, one of the challenges is that there are so many different units. And so you would expect that those units each are going to have their own unique management needs, and it's a balance with the Institute of doing research that can be more broadly used across the whole system or really unique to a particular wilderness area. And I think there is some research that gets done in both, and Chris will talk about some in the Everglades that is pretty specific to the Everglades. But it's definitely a good comment for sure. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll just speak up. Thanks, Teresa, and say that, we actually do have a topic on that in there related to kind of wilderness governance and decision space. And I can't exactly remember how we phrase it, but Matt, it's a really good point, and it's something we think about a lot. And I think it'd be a really good line of research. As you say, it's a little bit different, and maybe not even get close to, I don't know if that's true, but there is, when you start to research and do empirical work related to the mechanisms and the mechanics of the government, it does get a little tricky, right? I always try to, it's like your internal affairs or something at a cop show. And so it's tricky research, but it is important, and it's something that I think about a lot. So how we analyze and investigate the governance structure that is the Forest Service or wilderness stewardship more broadly is a good thing to think about. And I'll talk a bit about shared stewardship when I get up, and that's sort of related.
Okay, well, I can continue on, but once again, here's that link. So please, anyone and everyone, I encourage you to go and do your own rankings so that we can put your input into our analysis in a couple of weeks.
Hey, Teresa, just a quick time check. We're just over an hour in,
Okay.
55 minutes left to go.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so I am going to introduce two different scientists that couldn't be here today, and a project that they are both working on together. Lisa Hollinger is an ecologist at the Institute who specializes in geospatial analysis and fire ecology and climate change. And Sean Parks is a research ecologist, and he is focuses also on climate change and fire and also connectivity. So a project that they both asked me to emphasize was thinking about climate change and how it's likely to reshape vegetation in North America's largest protected areas. And so for this project, they were looking at 22 protected areas. And you can see those parks there, and they did cover into the east with the Great Smokies. And the aim was and is to develop fine scale vegetation maps, thinking mid-century and then late century based on climate projections. And so to do this, they used a climate analog approach, which is where you identify areas today where the climate might be similar to projected climate for a given place of interest. And when they did that, and then you apply the climate scenarios, you can then map what may be in the future. And so I'm just going to give you two quick examples of some of those results that are coming in. This one is from Death Valley. And the big thing you can see here is this big area of what they're calling novel climate coming in by 2085, and a loss of that alpine sparse barren snow area. And then this is from Yellowstone National Park. And the big thing that you can see in 2085 is this really big increase in shrubland that corresponds to a pretty big decrease in that cold montane conifer forest. And you're also getting an increase in that western dry conifer forest. Oh, those were not, there we go. So the final project I'm going to talk about is thinking about historical and cultural use of fire by Indigenous people in wilderness. And this project has really been initiated by other projects that, that I have been involved in where we have done ethnographies with Native people. And there's been anecdotal discussion of fire and how fire has been used in the past. And we began thinking that along a latitudinal gradient, so from Alaska down through Montana into the Southwest, that because of social differences, land tenure differences, and habitation differences of Native people, that the use of fire historically might be different. And we also know that those are very ecologically diverse ecosystems, from really cold to quite warm, and that too might, that ecological variation would be very tightly linked to the social variation in how people have used that landscape, and therefore how they may have used fire. So that is a project that is starting up and underway and is pretty exciting. And I also feel that there's potential with this project to expand into the East, because there absolutely is evidence of historical and cultural use of fire by Indigenous people on the east side of our country. So with that, I can answer any questions that people may have, or we can move on to Chris.
I'm not seeing any specific questions in the chat. So gone. Unless you have a question now, otherwise we'll shift to the next presenter, Chris, sounds like.
It's Kathy.
Oh, Kathy, I'm sorry about that.
Best for last. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everyone see it?
I can see it. You're good to go, Kathy.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, John. So hey everybody, thanks for being here today. My name is Kathy Zeller. I'm a research biologist with the Leopold Institute. And I really got my start in this area way back when I was just out of undergrad, and I took a job as a field tech on an ecological survey in Alaska. And it was my first time in Alaska, my first time in these really, really big wild landscapes. I immediately fell in love and knew that I wanted to work to study and conserve these areas going forward. So that eventually led me to my master's work, where I focused on designing regional conservation networks. So identifying priority areas for conservation and then connectivity between those areas. And a lot of that work focused on using large carnivores as umbrella or focal species to do that. That eventually led to my PhD, where I worked on wildlife connectivity modeling, mostly with mountain lions, but with some other species as well. And then recently started at the Leopold Institute just over a year ago. So I'm going to talk about the wilderness and wildlife connection and needs for research. So there's really these two broad categories for this wilderness wildlife research. One is how important is wildlife for wilderness, and how important is wildlife for wilderness character. And the other is, how does the existence and maintenance of wilderness character in an individual area affect the wildlife that lives there or lives around it? I'm going to break these out individually and talk about them each for a minute. So in terms of wildlife affecting wilderness character, sometimes just the presence of a certain wildlife species really evokes the sense of a really wild place, right? So thinking of grizzly bears or wolves or bighorn sheep or mountain lions. And especially for certain wilderness areas are even named after these iconic wildlife species. So the bighorn sheep, for example, there's a wilderness area in Southern California named for it. So just the fact that a certain species resides in a place might really contribute to the wilderness character or the character of that place. But there might be threats to maintaining these wildlife species in these areas. So climate change is an obvious one. As Teresa presented some of Sean and Lisa's work, they're showing that there's vegetation shifting, species that are there today might not be there tomorrow given fire and climate change. The same goes for wildlife species, right? So climate change might be having really large impacts on species and the presence of species in certain areas. Studies have shown that species are actually moving their ranges 10 kilometers further north every decade in the Northern Hemisphere. And this is way faster and way further than previously thought. And some species just won't be able to track the climate that they need. And won't be able to keep up this pace. So there's likely to be lots of changes in species composition in wilderness areas in the future. So one question remains, how does this affect wilderness areas and how does this affect wilderness character? Not only are we dealing with climate change, but we're dealing with habitat fragmentation, which can have large effects on species inside of wilderness. So particularly for those populations of wildlife that are either migratory or need really, really large areas in order to maintain their populations. So they're spanning multiple protected or multiple wilderness areas. So for example, the bighorn sheep I talked about earlier, they're actually being affected by both of these factors, both climate change and fragmentation is really threatening the sheep in these areas. So the questions on this side of the flowchart are, when do managers intervene and implement things like assisted migration or reintroduction of wildlife species? What tactics might make certain management actions more successful than others? And how do we make decisions given these shifting baselines into the future? So on the other side of this flowchart here is the other question. So how does just the existence of wilderness areas or areas that might have wilderness character, how might those affect wildlife species? So I'll just contrast a couple studies. We've got this little black-capped chickadee here on the left, and it's been shown that populations do much, much better for the species inside of wilderness areas because there's just better habitat, less fragmented habitat for these species in those upland areas. However, the boreal owl on the right, living in one of the largest wilderness areas in the Frank Church in the US, that study found that these owls weren't doing as well in wilderness areas, presumably because the habitat for the owls just wasn't as productive in wilderness areas. So there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of things that we might want to learn about how wilderness are affecting wildlife and which wildlife species might benefit from wilderness as opposed to other species. And also, I just want to point out that these are only 2 studies that have specifically looked at wilderness effects on wildlife. Other studies have looked at protected areas and things like that, but there's really a lack of knowledge in terms of wilderness effects on wildlife species and populations. And so these studies have also, there's just not a lot of these studies at different spatial scales, right? So we can think about doing studies in terms of how a single wilderness area might affect a single wildlife species, or many wilderness areas affecting one species, or many wilderness areas affecting many species. So there's all of these different spatial and hierarchical scales we could be looking at as well. And one example of that is this study, going back to that question about nonprofits. So this was a study put out through a partnership with the Wilderness Society and the Leopold Institute. And what the study did was they took a look at wildlife species richness across the continental United States and how protected areas represented these species. So not wilderness specifically, but how these species are represented in protected areas. And so this map on the lower right is species richness. And you can see the more species richness are the redder colors. And as you all probably know, there's a ton of species richness in the southern region. And what they found is that only 5% of all wildlife species in the US and 11% of species of conservation concern have a good chunk of their habitat in highly protected or wilderness areas. So a really low number of these species have sufficient habitat residing within already protected areas. So this really points to assessing protected and wilderness areas in the larger landscape context for wildlife, right? So what's going on not only in these protected areas, but outside of them, and maybe how connected are they, and how can they really provide for more species of wildlife, more species of concern across our landscape. So one project that I'm working on, admittedly not in the southern region, but in the Crown of the Continent ecoregion, is taking a look at that. We're partnering with an organization called the Crown Managers Partnership, which has stakeholders across the Crown of the Continent ecoregion, and also consists of agencies, including Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, tribes, lots of nonprofits in the area. And what they're doing is they are planning a landscape conservation design for this region. And so we at the Leopold Institute are modeling connectivity to help inform that landscape conservation design. And we're doing that using the focal species that the Crown Managers Partnership have already identified. These species are grizzly bears, wolverine, a couple of sound-mounted species, lynx, mule deer, and elk. And the goal here is to predict current and future habitats as well as corridors for these species in a changing climate. So we're going to be projecting forward into the future. And we're also going to be looking very closely at how wilderness areas are forming the backbone or really anchors for this system in terms of ecological integrity and ecological health. Another project I just wanted to touch on, we've been calling the Climate Atlas for Wildlife, or CLAW. And it's really just in its initial stages right now, but the vision is to do this across the whole continental United States. And what we're hoping to do there is take species data, model highly suitable habitat and areas of connectivity, again, not only for the current time step, but into the future. And so on this slide, I'm showing an example of a much smaller study area across the Great Basin of the Western US on Pronghorn, where we did this, and we showed changes in suitable habitat and connectivity through time, and areas that were resilient to climate change. And these products are actually being used by a lot of the the wildlife managers across the Great Basin. And then I just wanted to add one more box to this flowchart and talk for a minute about how wilderness management affects wildlife. So things like recreation impacts, number of users, campsites, trails, all of these different things, just how we manage wilderness areas may also be having an effect on wildlife. So that would be another box to add to this flowchart. And then I have a question here for everyone that is, what research needs might you have regarding wilderness and wildlife? But maybe we can, because we're sort of running short on time and I want to make sure Chris has enough time, maybe we can just stop here and then let Chris present and we can sort of loop back around to that question.
Kathy, and if you'll pop it in the chat, just so I think it's a pretty simple question, but pop it in there. Maybe folks will have something to throw in the chat to keep the conversation going.
Sure, yeah, thanks. So Chris, take it away.
Great. Okay, are folks seeing just my presentation?
You're not in presentation mode, but yes, we can see it.
Oh, okay, but you can see the slides. That's okay.
I can, yes.
Okay, presentation. I'm not sure the distinction there, I guess. But okay, cool. So really
Chris,
good
we
to
can
be here.
Seeing all your notes.
We see presenter view.
Oh, you see my notes. Okay, so let's do that. Excuse me. Oh boy.
Chris, in the lower right-hand corner, there's by the Zoom button, there is the presenter or the presentation view on the far right, right next to the slider for the Zoom.
Okay. Oh yeah, right here. Normally I just share it and it pops up. Hide presenter view. Many apologies. Okay. Are folks seeing? How about now?
Great.
Okay, cool. All right, so really good to be here, everybody, and let's get this over here so you're seeing it. I thought I'd start with who I am first. So just based in Missoula, Montana, and I've been spending most of this time in the pandemic with these three folks. Couple of kids, Maeve and Beckler are the little ones there, and there's a picture of Beckler next to a sign outside of Yellowstone with his namesake. And in terms of the science, I onboarded as a research social scientist in March of 2020. And that's after spending a lot of time with the Leopold Institute in a variety of other capacities. And generally my work's focused on kind of wildlands management and planning through an interdisciplinary social-ecological systems lens. And, you know, what I mean by that is broadly, I consider myself like a social scientist, and why that may be a bit general and non-specific, it kind of underscores my inability to really claim a specific field. You know, my training broadly includes research focused on human nature relationships, or the use of kind of qualitative and quantitative approaches to understand how human well-being is supported by a variety of benefits flowing from public lands. And so I'm also interested in how that knowledge can actually support managers on the ground. So a fair amount of my work focuses on integrating social science approaches into public engagement processes, and I'll talk a bit about that here at the end. And so, you know, I don't claim psychology or economics, and I think that's fitting because, you know, as I provide a background to social science work at the Institute, the broad nature of work kind of will become clear here. And so, so moving on, you know, in the coming slides, I'll just do a kind of simplified overview. So I'm really going to cover all of Alry's social science, kind of do some history, and then bring you up to some speed on what I'm doing as well. And I'll present some work that's taking place in the southern region, as well as some stuff that's happened in the past. So try to make those connections to the south real clear. And I'll also mention kind of quick mention of where you can find some of the resources that are available. So we've got an archive, and you can find some of this work out there, and even some of the data as well if you're interested in that. And so I'll highlight where that is. But really, recreation is one of the more kind of traditional and extensive areas of wilderness research at Alry. It's kind of really where it all started. This long history reaches back prior to 1993, as Jason kind of highlighted, that Forest Service work unit. And this is where discussions of, you know, really goes back to the 60s, discussions of the social caring capacity originated. Solitude research, you know, with a focus on monitoring encounters, was stressed and integrated into rec frameworks such as carrying capacity, limits of acceptable change, recreation opportunity spectrum. People like George Stanky and Bob Lucas were really pioneers of this work. And much of that work still informs managers today, particularly in the US, as managers actively track wilderness character. And on the naturalness side, or natural science side of things, this recreation work is, you know, rec ecology. We had that mentioned earlier as a potential need for managers. And that looks at, you know, how human use of wilderness impacts that resource. And David Cole was at the forefront of this work, and he was at the Institute for a long time, of course. And then there's a long history of research focused on conflict, such as between different canoeists and motorboat users, or hikers and stock users. You know, there's been work on fees or potential impact of kind of charging fees to access wilderness lands. Trust research about kind of trust between the agencies and the general public is another element of this on-site work, which has been pursued really kind of in the 90s and into the 2000s, and some in the last 12 or 15 years as well. And then, you know, some of that trust research has been done in specific contexts, like fire management and the Bitterroot, for example. And currently, a couple projects that I'm working on within the rec context are developing a process to determine user capacity on wild and scenic rivers. And that's a policy mandate for such rivers in the US. And additionally, working on a very challenging, you know, problem managing visitors in high use areas. And so this is obviously an important and dynamic issue. And specifically, we're working on a project in Alpine Lakes outside of Seattle. And I mentioned that because I did see Carly Reed on the call. She's part of that project. And you know, the question about nonprofits, how do we engage nonprofits? That's a really good example. That project is what we're calling kind of this, hopefully an innovative approach to shared stewardship. And we've got a lot of partners, and you know, there's a research arm to that team, but there's also the Forest Service management arm. And then there's, you know, some non-governmental partners as well, like Society for Wilderness Stewardship. And they've been really involved in both kind of the planning and partner engagement, but also getting into the science with us a bit too. So that's one example of where I think NGOs can come into play. And then we're also another project that I'll speak to a bit more in a bit is in the southern region. It's taking place in the Everglades. And I know that's the National Park Service, but I think what we'll learn from that project, and one of the goals is to get kind of a programmatic survey for visitor use management, will have a lot of, I think, lessons that are relevant to the Forest Service, even though it's, you know, another land management agency. It being locally relevant, I think will be important and valuable. And then kind of another place we've really looked is human nature relationships and relevance. And so, you know, much of that rec focus work is on the on-site experience, and that work has been done and it continues to be done. But we also have kind of how people relate to wilderness more broadly. And there was a question of getting NSRE going. That would be a good example, right? That's more about these wilderness values broadly and how people think they're relevant, whether that's clean air or clean water. And we can kind of split hairs on the terminology, but I am kind of partial to human nature relationships just because it's broad. It doesn't start with a loaded term like ecosystem services. And it gets at the point that people relate to these landscapes in lots of different ways. And so it could be the benefit for its symbolism, you know, human restraint and humility provides this kind of value or benefit, whether or not you're using the space or not. Subsistence use, exercising treaty rights, practicing culture, these are all important elements of that relationship. And research in the past at the Institute's focused on kind of indigenous peoples' relationship with the land, and particularly within Alaska and the circumpolar north. And, you know, we've also looked at kind of through some ecosystem service research, how social well-being is threatened by a variety of drivers of change, including climate change, but more specific impacts as well. And so the Leopold Institute's kind of long participated in and supported work that's allowed us to more clearly articulate these various benefits and the relevance of wilderness and the ways we might adapt in the face of, you know, different stressors. And so future research on this relevance work to different cultures and social groups is certainly on the list of important things. And as Jason highlighted, the new hire related to diversity, equity, inclusion, I think we'll cover a lot there. And then lastly, we have kind of this, some of the applied tools and governance, if you will. And so, you know, there's this basic and applied science, but as a research and kind of development, you know, stressing that part outfit, we're, you know, have also provided support to wilderness stewards and beyond by developing some real applied tools. So wilderness character monitoring is a practice that's formalized within the Forest Service and beyond, and the Keeping It Wild GTRs, I know many of you are familiar with. You know, I've heard managers call that their Bible. Peter Landers was the leader on that, and he worked with others, of course. And then we've also done some work on public engagement. That's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So there's the planning track, but there's also that more informal kind of public engagement side of things as well. And I'll speak a bit more to this work in a bit, but you know, the shared stewardship is another thing that we're working on. This Alpine Lakes project. We did a little querying of the wilderness community at the National Wilderness Workshop in 2019 in Bend about kind of the challenges of doing shared stewardship. So really getting at that partnership work. And I think maybe that's someplace maybe that we could all collaborate, or potentially with the southern region in the future. Okay. So kind of connections to the southern region. And I'm just going to kind of go over some past and current work. And then I'll talk about maybe the future. But I just wanted to bring up the slides of, you know, while maybe there isn't a ton of ongoing work right now, there is kind of a nice history of some research in the past. And so here's some, these are visitor use surveys that exist. So in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a great study that was replicated across three wilderness areas in the southern region: Cohutta, Caney Creek, and Upland Island. And, you know, so the same survey was done in all those areas. So that information is really neat and can kind of be compared. But it also provides this opportunity as we think forward about future research, maybe to do some trends. And a similar study, albeit it was separate, was at Shining Rock in 1990. And so again, here's an opportunity. Someone mentioned understanding how, you know, opinions have changed in the last, since 1964. Can't necessarily go back to 1964 in these specific areas, but we can go back to 1990 and learn how things have changed in the last 30 years, especially if these areas are facing contemporary challenges or potentially updating their planning in any formal way. And then we've got in 2001, Okefenokee, and again, this is not Forest Service, but still relevant probably in what you learn and how visitors relate to the landscape. And then ongoing, we have a project in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Wilderness in Florida. So that's in Everglades again, NPS, but that's a project that's happening right now. So I think the information will be salient, and that survey is still being developed. And to, I think it was Peter's question about potentially NSRE stuff, we are going to include a survey question that includes those items. So we'll at least be able to kind of see how it's changed in that context, or maybe hasn't changed related to those values, those broad wilderness values. And then lastly, the Caney Creek in Arkansas, it's worth noting, has seen some work. This is a rec ecology study, so 93, 94, and then again in 2007, you're going to have those campsite information. This was a David Cole project. So these are all previous projects, with the exception of the ongoing one in Florida, that are happening in the South or have happened in the South, and that data is available. The publications are available. So it's something to, maybe that work's a little dated, but there's still probably some lessons to be learned from that work because it's so context specific. And then it does provide kind of future opportunities, which is what I want to talk about next. And so, future collaborations. Visitor use survey seems like an obvious one. That's support we do. That's our bread and butter. That could be trend studies. If you are somebody who is familiar with some of the last, wilderness areas that I flashed there, let me know, and we can think about how to make that work. And then support for public engagement and planning processes. I do a lot of that work myself. And so if you've got any formal planning coming up and need help with the public engagement, we've developed some methods that can help fit into that. And then finally, this shared stewardship, what does that mean? That's a really broad idea, but that was the other thing that struck me when the question was about engaging nonprofits. And this seems to be the clear conduit to that engagement. And really, SAWS, for example, has been given a lot of kudos from a lot of different people I've talked to about their partnership model. And I've heard interest in replicating that. And, there might be a place for research in that process to understand what it is about that model, that's worked or hasn't worked. And if those things can be formalized, there are science questions in there that could not only contribute to the literature about collaborative governance, but could also really inform, I think, on the ground stewardship, across a broad region. So kudos to SAWS, because I've heard a lot of really good things there. So I could see a potential interaction or collaboration there. And lastly, I'll just kind of wrap up because I want to leave some time for questions. Just some resources that are out there. If you go to our website, you can find a publication page. It has full access to all publications, free, of course, and then the archive, 58 data sets right now for download. So any of the data sets I just flashed from the 1990 studies are there. Whether you're a graduate student or know somebody who's trying to just come up with a project, you can kind of have fun with those data and learn from them, but also maybe use them within your day-to-day. And it does highlight where you could do a trend study and start to understand how have these changed? How have things changed in Shining Rock in the last 31 years or Caney Creek or wherever you may be? And beyond that, there's, recreation ecology studies, there's fire atlas maps. So this archive has a lot in there. So just know it exists and it's free and open to the public, and it doesn't matter where your computer's accessing it from, it's all there. And so with those resources, I'll just kind of wrap up, and looks like we got about 20 minutes for questions. So thanks so much, everybody, for hanging in there and listening to us and letting us work through the changing of the screens. All right.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And yeah, we've got about 20 minutes, and I know we've been kind of going through the questions throughout the presentation, but this is a great time. They've all been great questions. So don't stop now. Let's see what else is out there. I'm going to throw one out. I kind of addressed it back through the chat, but I think this could be open to one, maybe was in Kathy's realm, but in the work I've done, I've found that when I ask specialists about non-Indigenous species in wilderness, they honestly don't know much. My question is, how do we involve specialists in wilderness when their work so far rarely requires them to go into wilderness, which is a tricky one for sure. And anyone can take that one on.
Yeah, John, can you expand on that more? Wait.
How I interpreted that question, and I think it was that, Sarah, you feel free to come on if you would like, is that whenever an issue comes up in wilderness, it just automatically gets handed off to the recreation trails wilderness manager. It's usually that person. And all the time, as I talk to folks who stress that it's an interdisciplinary nature of wilderness, it's not a recreation resource. And that's really erroneous to say that. You know, there's a lot of other things going on. And most programs within the Forest Service, the outside of timber, have some role or responsibility in wilderness management, whether that be wildlife or heritage or variety of other things. But it's always a challenge and a chore to bring the resources to the table sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think research could potentially help with that. There's ways to model invasive species spread, and just to be able to get a handle on where hotspots might be that might warrant more boots on the ground, taking a look at places where we might want to check out and see if this could be an issue with invasives or non-native species.
Yeah, and I think interpreting a comment that came in just now too is that I think when they think about what's required to take action in wilderness, sometimes that process is a little daunting. And I hope that's changing. I know they're working on a new MRDG form that streamline is the wrong term, but just make it not so arduous to go through that process. It's just, that's how our policy is set up, that some higher levels of line officers hold authorities for certain projects, whether it be with chemicals or other things. So hopefully that'll dispel that myth and make some other, programs willing to come to the table.
Hey, John, if you
Sarah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Jason, and then Sarah, I see your hand up.
No, that's what I was going to say. Go take it away, Sarah.
Hi guys. So I just wanted to clarify, the work I've been doing is wilderness character monitoring. I've written about 9 baselines for 2 different forests, and that was something that was just really difficult to get information on. And sometimes I myself come from a background of biology, but I have not nearly as much experience as people working on the forest. And so sometimes I had to make decisions about things that, I didn't really entirely know about. And I feel like, there should be some way that we're getting these specialists in there so that way we can know what we're managing and, do a better job in preserving character and doing the Wilderness Act.
Yeah, just from my experience with some of that, Sarah, it's, I guess it's hit or miss in some cases. I've found some specialists across forests and districts to really get into this work that we do with wilderness character monitoring and want to engage and provide that data. And I don't know if that's just, past work experience in wilderness or personal interest in wilderness, but you do hit some stumbling blocks sometimes, and those folks are, for whatever that reason might be, that's tough. So just, I guess, keep fighting the good fight the best you can, and hopefully you'll start making some inroads with some of those folks. And please, anyone speak up if I'm not summarizing or paraphrasing, putting words in your mouth on some of these comments. Please feel free to come off mute and join the conversation. Another question popped up. After research has been done, does it help get money for funding that may need to be taken based on research?
John, I think I might look back to you to answer that question.
I think the short answer is yes. If you are looking to, put in a competitive proposal of some kind, whether it be internal or external, having data and other information to support what you're trying to either, change management on the ground or do other things, it's going to be helpful. The better you can tell your story as to why this, action needs to happen. And if you've got some great data to support it and analysis, you're going to be in a better spot as you, try to sell your project, so to speak.
John Pete Irvin,
Go for it, Pete.
old retired guy. Jason has heard this before, but for the broader audience, I guess I'm beating the drum on resurrecting the National Survey of Recreation and the Environment. And I think to many folks, it's so basic that it's hidden. And I acknowledge up front that this is something that historically has been done by the Southern Research Station and not the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. It's been led many years by Ken Cordell, now an emeritus, but who definitely has an interconnection with the Leopold Institute as well as the Southern Research Station. And just to folks on the call, that is scientific information about what the American public values most about wilderness. And as a retired Forest Service Wilderness Program Manager, it has been invaluable to me in getting the attention of